Well, Mr. Martin, I see you do not have your Kona Kai sweatshirt on today.
It needs to be washed.
Oh.
Shanna's here.
Here's Shanna right here. Let's take a quick look.
Yeah.
Say hi, Shanna.
Hello.
By the way, Shanna has the most fabulous, beautiful hair I've ever seen in my life. When I want to get healed of a cold or something, I just put my hand on top of her head, and the spongy effect of her thick, beautiful hair makes me get well. It has talismanic properties. Yeah, the shirts, the sweatshirt, I love it dearly, but it just got rank, so it's being washed.
All right. Would you like to tell the viewer about the Kona Kai Club for us today?
Yeah, I was his first lifeguard way back in 1955, I think it was, when they opened it up. They built a causeway across the way, Shelter Island Drive. It used to be an island. I used to ditch school in junior high school and hightail it over the top of the point in the sagebrush. In those days, there was no fleet ridge or no houses up there. I'd go down to the bay and swim and go out to the island in search of another rowboat for my fleet. So how do we get on Shelter Island? Oh, the Shelter Island. And then finally they built the road over there, and they started to develop. They put in the Valley High restaurant down at the north end, and the Kona Kai Club at the south end of this fashionable island today. And so I was the lifeguard there. So I'm kind of partial to it. I've been a member for like 1,360 years, something like that. And,
I think you're a member for life now, right?
No, you still got to pay the dues. $90 a month. But it's convenient. Hell, we get to go over there and work out. However abbreviated those workouts may be. Okay, that's yeah, okay.
Okay, well that's the story behind the Kona Kai sweatshirt. Hey, keeping with the general theme, and we really didn't start off to be a general theme, but it sort of, the last couple of times we've talked, we've gotten inputs on what brought you to the point of significance and how now you're one of the most significant men in history. But one of the ones and the viewer could read it in a wonderful chapter of Peru and the Age of Innocence. But could you tell us about your interaction with Captain Godshak?
Oh, gladly. That was one of the great moments of my life. I was on the Porta del Sol, which is a little rusty Panamanian freighter, working for passage on the way back from South America after being exposed to some of the largest surf I've ever been out in, 20 to 25 foot, say, off of Punta Hermosa, which is about 45 kilometers or kilometers south of Lima. And there were 55 members in the Club Waikiki, which was located at Miraflores, which is outskirt of Lima. It's a real nice place out there. And the membership consisted of aristocrats, guys in their 30s and more. A few members that were under 30, but only 3 of them went out on this surf. And of course I was from California, so they figured I was a Superman. And I'd never been out and surfed that big in my whole life. Been out in big days, but never that big. That was so big that when a guy was riding a wave on those things, he looked like a little toy soldier, little toy man. It dwarfed the size of the surfer. It was a weird sight. And I said to myself when I was paddling out there, well, I guess I died today. You know, I don't think I can even catch one of these things. I had a 10-foot long board, and anyway, I rode those waves, and I became an honorary member of that club. They gave me a big banquet before I left to come back to San Diego on this freighter. So I'd had a hell of an adventure in Peru, and I sold my surfboard for $85 to one of the renowned surfing legends of the Club Waikiki. His name was Alfredo Granda Jr. They called him Pecho, meaning the chesty one, and also Tiburon Tito, which is little shark, because he was a womanizer, and his father was Tiburon. So anyway, they get that into the background here, and so I'm sky high. I've crossed the Andes. I've gone to the to a place called Tarma at over 10,000 feet elevation, in a valley that had, can you believe it, eucalyptus trees. At our latitude here, at 32.5 degrees north, that would be above tree line. But down there it was 14 degrees, I believe it is, 12 or 14 degrees south of the equator. So it was well within the realm of the tropics. So you had to get to a very, very high elevation before you got to tree line, where there were no more trees growing. Anyway, I did all that stuff. I did all kinds of stuff, and it was a great adventure, and it's a wonderful chapter in my autobiography. But on the way home, the captain of the Porta del Sol invited me into his quarters, which was a capacious office. He had books on all the walls, not just maritime books, which was his trade, but also the classics. He had all the Russian writers, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Turgenev, so on, and Shakespeare, and the classics, everything. And he liked me, and I liked him. He was Polish and German. Godshak was his name. His whereabouts originally were Pomerania. He was in a prisoner of war camp, I understand, and a polyglot. He spoke, I think, it was either 4 or 5 languages: Polish, German, French, Spanish, English, 5. And very handsome. He looked a lot like the actor Maximilian Schell. He was very old to me in those days. He was 54, and I thought that was ancient. He didn't have any gray hair, and being very well read and very accomplished in his life, I do believe he had lost his wife along the way somewhere, which would explain why he was a captain of a little forgotten, rusty Panamanian freighter. But they paid him well, I believe. I heard rumors to that effect, because he was bringing back frozen tuna from northern Peru to San Diego, where there was a cannery, the Westgate, California Tuna Packing Company. And that's where I saw the ship the first time. Said, hey, I wonder if I could get on that thing. I'd asked around on the docks, where's it going and what's it doing? Well, it journeys down to Peru. Sometimes it'll have a cargo of insecticides or something like that, and it'll stop off in Central America on the way down. But its destination is Paita, Peru, which in the northern part of Peru, way up there, just under the border of Ecuador. And it would tarry for a week and load up with tuna. So I figured if I went down there, I could have a week to adventure in South America and try out their surf. I'd heard stories that they have really great surf down there. It faces, the coastline faces southwest, which faces all the storms that traverse the longitudes that sweep out all of the South Pacific and skirts below Australia, so that the big storms in the Indian Ocean can even sweep into the Pacific and cross all the way over. So it had regular surf. It was really fantastic. So on the way back on the Porta del Sol, Captain Godshak asks me into his quarters. And he wanted to know about my adventures, and I told him. And he repeated what he said in his interview with me before I went down there. He said, why aren't you not in college? And I told him that college was sterile and unproductive for me. It didn't inspire my curiosity. It was probably because I was majoring in all the subjects that are the least rewarding, as far as I'm concerned, other than the so-called humanities, was business administration, for God's sake. Can you imagine going to college and getting a degree in business administration? It's for all the flunkies. And I chose it for that reason. I didn't want to have to work. College was not some place for me to go get educated. I knew that was not the place for my education. It was a way station while I tried to figure out what the hell my philosophy of life should be. I had no idea what was right from wrong on an absolute basis and for all things. I had long outgrown the scriptures as the criterion of righteousness and rightness and wrongness. And so after a few moments discussing my adventures, Captain Godshak told me, he said, what are you reading? And I said, nothing. He says, nothing? You don't read? What have you read? And this was a reiteration of the question he began with on the way down. I said, I said, well, the Bible and the Hardy Boys. That was it. Oh yes, and the Bob Feller strikeout story. I had read that when I was in high school. And that's it. I hated to read. I didn't like books. I had a bad memory about it because of homework and all that crap you have to go through in the public school systems, which are really not schools, but as Galamo says, glue factories, where the school glues up all your mental parts up here so they're all stuck together, nothing works. So he said to me, he said, what do you expect to get out of all these wonderful adventures you've had? And I said, I don't know. I want to have a great life. And back home, there's so much bureaucratization of the country. I don't, everything's sterile and regulated. And I think America is dull and boring. I figured if I could throw my feet to the winds and go on a big adventure, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, and just come what may, maybe I would be able to get a clue as to what my destiny might be. Or words to this effect to Captain Godshak, and he listened very carefully to me. And then he said to me, he said, listen, he says, Bill, he says, I've got a forecastle down there full of men who have traveled around the world more times than you'll ever dream of traveling, but they cannot lend any charm or romance to what they've seen and what they've experienced because they have no literature in their belly. And until you can do that and multiply your experience by visiting distant lands and ancient peoples and so forth, you're not going to have the kind of background knowledge you need to have in order to fulfill whatever it is that fate has in store for you. You must become well-read. And one of his phrases that I really got out of him was that you have to be conversant with the heritage of Western civilization, meaning the civilization my ancestors as an Aryan have created, in contradistinction to all the other races. So that kind of whittled me down some. And I just said, I said, what should I read? And he said, for you, probably a good start would be Ernest Hemingway's The Green Hills of Africa. It's got adventure in it, got travel in it, and a wonderful dialogue at the beginning of it that has to do with literature and the importance of reading it. And though Hemingway was a man's man, an adventurer, and appealed immensely to the people of the world, he was a very serious scholar and a very great craftsman in his work. So I think you can get the bug if you read this book. And he says, in your quarters, if you look up into the book rack, there's a dog-eared paperback, The Green Hills of Africa. I suggest that you commence reading that. And he says, as a matter of fact, and I've never told anybody this before, it just now occurred to me. He said, and as for chipping paint and working here, he says, that's just, you don't need to do that. So the third mate to whom we'd been assigned, he got off too. So we had a vacation coming back. It was great. We read all day long. I did. Played poker, which I can't play because my emotions are too obvious, and I got the crap beat out of me in every hand I ever had. And these guys were poker-faced, serious devotees of the game. But I read, and when I got back to San Diego after that trip, I devoured the Green Hills of Africa. Just devoured the book, and I realized how bereft I was. So the first thing I did when I got back is I went down to Warren Brock's or somebody like that. I forget the name of the bookstore. It's downtown. It used to be down on Broadway. And I walked in to get more works by Hemingway. And I remember I asked the fellow that was the proprietor there, or one of the employees, obviously an egghead, And he says, why do you want to read Hemingway? Why don't you read somebody that's more sustaining than that? And I said, you got any suggestions? Because I had no idea who to read. He said, why don't you try reading Thomas Mann? And I said, who's he? And he said, he's a great German writer. And you should begin with his short stories, Tonio Kruger and The Merchant of Venice, and not Merchant of Venice, I forget now the name of the title, but anyway, his short stories. So I fetched out a volume of his short stories, but I still held on to Hemingway, and he gave me a copy of A Farewell to Arms, and I took that with me, and I bought both books, and I devoured them. I got home, and I just read the dickens out of them, and my folks didn't put any pressure on me to get a job right away, so I took advantage of that time. I read all day long, and I began to start underlining words that I didn't know the definitions of, and I got a secretary's a stenographer book, you know, those little notepad things, and I started writing down the words that I didn't know the meanings of, which was like an entire dictionary. I had no vocabulary to speak of because I hadn't read. And so I started working on my vocabulary way back then. I was 21 years old. And then one day after I finished Tonio Kruger's the short stories, I found Thomas Mann tedious and boring in most of his work. Occasionally there'd be flashes of real genius and great stuff, and I memorized that. I didn't memorize it, but I learned it, and I underlined those passages. But I dispensed with reading all of the stories. And these were all little strokes of wisdom, orchestrated, you might say, by my subconscious. Remember, I told my mother that I wanted to be a great man someday. And now, you know, I was on the road to it. My destiny was starting to unfold for me. I didn't plan for any of this. It just started happening. So I went down to a bookstore in Ocean Beach on Newport Street. There, it's gone now. It was called Burdine's. And I think it was a stationery store, I believe, and Shannon nods yes. And so there was a place where they had the modern library editions, hardbacks, the smaller ones, you know, and then the bigger ones, the giants. And I pulled out a giant because I was ambitious, and I pulled it out, the Essays of Charles Lamb. I said, well, that should be interesting. That's probably something I ought to know. And so I opened it up. And I was standing back. It was late in the afternoon. It was almost dark. And I was the only person in the store other than the owner, Mr. Burdine, I guess, or whoever that was. And he was watching me. And he didn't mind that I pulled out a book and just tarried there for a while, because I read a page out of that. And it was very dense literature, these essays. And I was very impressed with how deep it went and how serious it was. And I said, this is what I need to know. I need to become an intellectual. And that concept was just beginning to dawn on me. And so then it dawned on me that I have to, Hemingway had made the statement, I was going back, somewhere I read this along the way, that a writer has to know everything. Naturally he can't, but he should strive for it. And that just goes without saying. Well, I don't know, I hadn't read anything, and I was 21 years old, and so back to Charles Lamb, so I'm reading this essay, and I timed it, and I'm a slow reader because I do master what I read, and so it took me forever. One page, and then fate fell upon me like a flock of ravens. It just, and the weight of the world hit me. And I realized that if I were to extrapolate the time that it took to read one of these pages, it would take me until I was 30 or some preposterous age into the future. And I became, unbelievably depressed, because like my life was over. I wasted my entire existence. I'm 21 years old now, and I have not read anything and don't know anything. And by the time I finally sort of catch up, life will be over for me. Hell, I'll be 30 or more. So that hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't believe it. And So I closed the book. I put it back. I didn't even buy a book. I just was crushed. And I just aimlessly wandered out of the restaurant. And then I was walking up Newport Street back to my car, and I was coming up to a place, I forget the name of it, it was that bookstore on the south side of the street in the first block as you're going down. Julian would know it, she used to get cards there and stuff. It was another stationery store, but it dealt in pocketbooks. So I went in there because it was a lot cheaper, and I didn't have any money. And I bought, I looked around in there, and I found a book called The Lifetime Reading Plan by the great critic, I'll think of his name in a minute. And oh boy, I opened that up, and it took me back to the Greeks, and I read, now you're talking. Now this is what Captain Godshak was talking about, and I read, I got familiar with the name of, the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, and then there was the story of Greece, the story of history by Herodotus, and then the Peloponnesian War by, I can't remember the names now. But I read the Greek, I saw the Greek playwrights. I would have to read Aeschylus and Sophocles, Euripides, or Aristophanes, or Aristophanes. And boy, that was a tall order, And then I saw that there was a Roman section, Virgil and Lucretius and Dante. And then there was the beginning of the English writers, Chaucer. And oh my God, I was just starting out, and oh Lord, but it was organized, it was methodical, and there was an article written by the editor, what's his name, Clifton Fadiman, and he would introduce you to these authors, which I found fascinating, and I was off and running. I bought that book, and on the way home in the car, I remember swearing right and left with everything in the book. I was cursing the public schools. I was cursing my family. I was cursing the whole country I lived in for robbing me of my youth. I should have been reading from the age of 8 on. And if I'd been doing that, I would be well along in this book, and capable of producing probably my first manuscripts at age 21 to 22, as Hemingway did. He never went to college. He just read himself and adventured. So all of the words of Godshak came to pass, and I got over my temper tantrum, and I cursed out the entire establishment, and that was the beginning of my awakening there too. The entire system and the establishment was opposed to me. I was its slave for all those years and still was. And all of these inputs were converging upon me with tremendous, almost sudden necessity, and it inspired me. I became soul enchanted, and I began to toil upwards in the night. And of course, I read Longfellow along the way, who said, "The heights by great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, for they, while their companions slept, were toiling upwards in the night." So. That's going ahead a little bit in time, but in the interim I decided that I needed a woman, and I needed to put some stretch in my life to make me get out and get a job. And so I fell in love with a Mexican girl, thinking that she was a wonderful little sweetheart, and it was very noble of me, an Aryan, to marry below my racial status, because she got baptized, became a little Christian. She was a bride in Christ with me. We were all equal before Christ, and another tyranny that I had yet to uncover in my life. But I married her, and we had kids right away, and 4 of them, as a matter of fact, 4 boys. But that put tremendous pressure on me. So then I decided that I should get a job. And I did. I got an accounting clerk's job at General Dynamics Astronautics, an hourly paid job. I was a yellow badger. I had absolutely no prestige whatsoever, and that's exactly what I wanted. Because I said the biggest mistake I've already made this decision when I was going to college. That's going back a ways. But I figured the biggest mistake people make is as soon as they get out of high school, they think they got to go to college to get a degree so they can get a nice job and have a place in society that's looked upon as proper and respectable. And you know, they wind up in suburbia. They get the house, they get the cute little wife, they have a nice little car, they get into debt, they never get out of it, and they spend the rest of their days like that. I didn't want that. There was no greatness associated with that, so I said, I'll get a job, but it's got to be a job that does not tempt me with raises and salaries and promotions. I need to have a mindless job where I can make enough money to support myself and my family and my little children. And meanwhile, I will read the lifetime reading plan and other literature along the way, and start studying the law in a correspondence course, because I figured that that'd kill two birds with one stone. I'd learn a lot about the ways of the world as the way we're out in it. And at the same time read the classics and get belles lettres under my belt to fulfill what Captain Godshak said, you know, that unless you don't have any literature in your belly, and until you do that, you won't be able to lend any charm or romance to your life's experiences. You need to multiply your experience and build up your background knowledge. Well, I was hell bent on getting that done pretty early on. So 5 years later, I was now 28 years old. And I know I'm skipping some things here, but just give you some quick headlines, and then I'll come back to Captain Godshak. 5 years later, finally the inevitable happened, and I got fired. I got laid off, and I was totally unemployed. I was 28 years old, too old to get a management trainee job for a white-collar job, because they don't pick guys 28 years old. They get guys who are just out of college. So I was pretty lost, but I knew by then that my vocabulary, my grasp of history, pretty good smattering of science and philosophy, and just literature in general, not to mention my study of the law, which I got down pretty far in that, all the way down to real estate law, and then I realized that was a profession designed for quibbling, and I learned the basic stuff about criminal law and domestic relations and the history of law and property and all that. And then that was, so that was behind me. I dropped that correspondence program, and that's when, this is for another interview, but we might do that the next time. Is when I was able to convince the branch manager of the Connecticut General Life Insurance Company that I was eminently qualified for estate planning, even though the corporate hiring policy precluded the hiring of a non-college graduate. And I got past that when I explained to the interviewer my educational background, which did not include college. He couldn't understand how I'd been to college. I'd had 2.5 years of college, you know, majoring in business administration. But they don't seem to care. As long as you got a degree, you got a certificate. But that's another story. So at the end of 5 years, I finally got into a profession, a real profession, and it was all because of one thing. I was able to quote Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether it's his nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, blah, 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 to the branch manager. And my background in literature so impressed him that he challenged me to quote from Shakespeare. I told him along the way that what I had read was the complete works of Shakespeare. And he stopped me. He said, "You sound too good to be true. You're very, very articulate. You really know how to sell, but you smack of a con man. A con man is a guy with a photographic memory, and he dazzles people with his recitation of statistics, and it's very impressive. And I have to know whether or not you really did read the complete works of Shakespeare, so I want you to quote something from it. And that's what's your pleasure. You want to hear the soliloquy of Hamlet, or would you like to hear Jake's speech in the Forest of Arden and As You Like It? You know, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women and players, they have their entrances and their exits and so on. And so I quoted the soliloquy, and we went to the Café del Remoro afterwards, and he said, "Let's continue these interviews." And 7 interviews later, they finally hired me, after the Home Office made an exception, because they only hired 1 out of 26 candidates, and they all had to be college graduates and preferably have some sales experience under their belt, which I had none. And I became the leading producer in the agency, broke all my own records year after year, finally went into my own business, and the rest is for later interviews. But coming back to Godshak, I remember the day I got hired, I was ecstatic, when I went home in the car to tell my little bride wife, my little child wife that I had, and Connie was her name, and I said to her, I was going to tell her that I'd gotten hired, and I remember driving down Laurel Street, and it was in the afternoon, or late morning, I think. I think it was late morning. I didn't have lunch because Jacobs was busy and had appointments in the afternoon. It was in the late morning. So it was gay, it was pretty, it was 11 o'clock, you know, or thereabouts. And I went down the hill and I was going down Laurel Street and the view of the bay, unobstructed by all the high rises they got now. And I said, with tears in my eyes, I was so grateful. I thanked Shakespeare. I said, hey, old buddy, you made it possible for me to do something really great here. And it was your eloquence that I was able to repeat that got me the job. But and then I thanked Captain Godshak, because it was his speech that really was, as it were, my road to Damascus. You know, Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, if you know your scriptures, which nobody knows that anymore either. But that was my conversion. I was sort of born again that day. And so that explains how important Captain Godshak is to me, and I've memorialized him in my book and other places, and like now.
Great. I think we should end on that just right now.
Yeah, okay.